Juan Carlos Ferrero sat down for an interview a few weeks ago and said something that got reported everywhere as a compliment. A former coach talking warmly about the player he helped build, wishing him well, laying out the path to greatness. Every headline ran with the same angle. Ferrero believes in Alcaraz. Ferrero says he can break the record. Ferrero is generous in defeat. Nobody asked the obvious question. Why is the man talking about discipline? The key will be that when motivation drops, discipline will guide him. That's what Novak has done brilliantly throughout his career. At the beginning, everything is enthusiasm, but there comes a time when you lose some freshness, and that's where work and discipline take charge. Here is what you need to understand before we go any further. Juan Carlos Ferrero did not wake up one morning in March 2026, flip open his laptop, and decide to offer a warm public endorsement of the player who had just quietly fired him 4 months earlier. That is not how this works. Ferrero is a measured, precise person, famously so. His players and colleagues have described him that way for years. He was already careful with his words when he was Alcaraz's coach. He became even more careful after the split, giving almost nothing away in public for weeks while the media swirled and his name was being dragged through every corner of Spanish sports journalism. So when he finally sits down and delivers what sounds like a heartfelt testimonial, you have to ask what is sitting underneath the words. Because with Ferrero, there is always something underneath the words. The sentence that everyone reported as a quote about Djokovic is actually a sentence about Alcaraz's problem. Not his future problem, but his current problem. The one that Ferrero lived with every single day for the better part of a year before the relationship finally collapsed. When he says the key will be that when motivation drops, discipline will guide him, he is not describing a hypothetical scenario somewhere down the road when Alcaraz is 31 and trying to grind out one last Wimbledon title. He is describing something that Ferrero watched happen up close, something that he felt powerless to correct in the way he wanted to correct it, something that ultimately became one of the fault lines in their relationship. He is not predicting Alcaraz's future. On the contrary, he is diagnosing his present. And the diagnosis is sitting right there in plain sight, dressed up as a compliment, and almost nobody noticed it. To understand why that matters, you have to go back to the Netflix documentary. If you have not watched it, the moment that caused the controversy was Ferrero, in a candid aside, expressing doubt about whether Alcaraz could be the best player in history. Not doubt about his talent. He has never doubted his talent. Nobody does. But doubt about the habits, the discipline, the structure of the life around the tennis. This landed like a grenade inside the Spanish tennis community, partly because it was filmed while Ferrero was still the coach, which made it feel like a private concern going public before its time. Ferrero tried to walk it back afterward. In the Cafelito interview, he clarified that Alcaraz always gave everything in training, that he was not questioning his work ethic on the court. But he did not fully retract the underlying sentiment. He just relocated it. Instead of doubting the work ethic, he pivoted to talking about what happens when the initial freshness wears off. Same concern, different clothing. And here is where it gets genuinely interesting, because the split itself was never really explained to anyone's satisfaction. The official version involved a contract negotiation that broke down over non-sporting clauses, private conditions that neither side made public, combined with growing tension over where Alcaraz based his training, and the increasing influence of the player's father over the direction of his career. These are real factors. They probably did contribute to the breakdown. But contracts between top players and elite coaches collapse all the time. And when they do, it is rarely just about the clauses on the page. There is always a human dynamic underneath. In this case, multiple sources across Spanish sports media consistently pointed to a specific friction. Ferrero wanted a certain level of control over Alcaraz's professional life, including his off-court commitments, his schedule, his rest habits. the boundaries between tennis and everything else that was increasingly competing for his time and attention. Alcaraz, at 22, having won 6 Grand Slams and become the most marketable tennis player on earth, had decided he wanted to make more of those decisions himself. That is not a scandal. That is a 22-year-old recognizing his own power. But it does create a situation where a deeply disciplined coach and a player whose natural inclination leans toward joy and freedom and spontaneity are eventually going to find the gap between them too wide to bridge on professional terms. Tony Nadal, of all people, understood it immediately when the split was announced. He said straight away that the reasons go beyond tennis, that when a player matures and the desire for independence grows, the balance of power inevitably shifts, and sometimes that shift becomes contentious. He was drawing from his own experience with Rafa, who separated from his uncle and coach in 2017 after years of total symbiosis, because the moment came when Rafa needed to feel like the decision-maker in his own career more than he needed the structural security that Tony provided. What is interesting about the Alcaraz-Ferrero version of this story is that it happened earlier and less cleanly. Rafa was 30 when he and Tony parted. Alcaraz was 22, which suggests either that Alcaraz matured into that independence faster than Rafa did, or that the tension between his natural personality and Ferrero's philosophy of discipline came to a head sooner than anyone expected, or both. Now, Ferrero knows all of this. So when he sits down in March 2026, 3 months after the split and weeks after Alcaraz has completed the career Grand Slam without him, without even saying his name in the press conference, not once, across 3 opportunities, and he chooses to anchor his entire GOAT endorsement around the concept of discipline, that is not an accident. He is not being malicious, but he is being precise. The man spent 7 years building the most successful player of his generation, and the thing he keeps coming back to, the thing he keeps identifying as the variable that will determine whether Alcaraz ends up with 25 Grand Slams or 14, is not the talent and not the technique and not the tactical intelligence. It is whether the boy can maintain the discipline when the fire of motivation is running low. That is a very specific thing to name, and Ferrero names it specifically because he has seen what happens when it slips. Here is what the Australian Open press conference told you that the official version of the split did not. Alcaraz won the tournament, his 7th slam, the completion of the career Grand Slam, the youngest man in history to do it. Enormous night, historic moment. 3 separate times during the post-match press conference, journalists referenced Ferrero, and 3 separate times Alcaraz navigated around saying the name. He spoke about his team and about the people who believed in him, as well as proving wrong the doubters. He talked about Samuel Lopez and his family, the man who coached him from the age of 15 and who has been in his box for 6 of his 7 Grand Slam victories, who Ferrero himself has described as someone he considers almost a son. That man did not get a mention on the biggest night of Alcaraz's career so far. And then shortly afterward, Ferrero unfollowed him on Instagram. What you are watching is not a clean break. Neither is it a professional handover between 2 adults who disagreed on contract terms and wished each other well. It is something more jagged than that, with things left unsaid on both sides. And the public statements from Ferrero are operating inside that jagged space. When he talks about discipline, he is talking about something that mattered so much to him that it eventually became unsalvageable. When he says Alcaraz needs discipline to guide him when motivation drops, the unspoken second half of that sentence is, "And I was the person providing that discipline, and now I am not." And the question of whether he can find it from another source or from within himself is one I genuinely do not know the answer to. That is what makes it a warning shot, not a threat, just the honest assessment of a very precise man who knows the player better than almost anyone alive and is describing as diplomatically as he possibly can the exact thing he is worried about. What complicates all of this is that Alcaraz promptly went out and had the best start to a season anyone has produced in years. 17 wins before his first loss, the Australian Open title, career Grand Slam at 22. These are not the results of a player whose discipline has collapsed. So, you could make a reasonable argument that Ferrero's concern has already been answered, that the split from a strict coach actually freed Alcaraz rather than endangered him, that Samuel Lopez's emphasis on joy in the training environment was exactly what was needed rather than a loosening of standards. Lopez said as much himself, that he brought freshness, that the team insisted on joy in the work. Alcaraz said he came to Melbourne focused only on himself and his team, blocking out everything external. These things are genuinely consistent with a player who has found a way to be both free and disciplined on his own terms, which is the ideal outcome. But here is the thing about seasons. They are long. The fire that gets you through January in Melbourne is a different fire from the one you need to find in October in Paris, when you are tired and the season is old, and the losses have accumulated, and the motivation requires more effort to access. Djokovic's greatness, and Ferrero pointed to Djokovic specifically and deliberately, was not built on permanent enthusiasm. It was built on the ability to replace enthusiasm with something more structural when enthusiasm ran dry, on the will to do the work when the work stopped feeling exciting, on the accumulated habits of a decade of total professionalism that operated independently of mood and form and circumstance. That is what 23 and 24 Grand Slams looks like from the inside. Not inspiration, infrastructure. The question Ferrero is actually asking, disguised as praise, is whether Alcaraz is building the infrastructure or whether he's still running largely on inspiration. At 22, you can win everything on inspiration. The talent is so far above the field that inspiration plus talent is enough. But inspiration has a shelf life. Every great champion eventually hits a period where the fire drops, where the love of competition goes temporarily quiet, where the body is tired and the mind has seen every scenario, and the thrill of the new has been replaced by the weight of the expected. Nadal went through it, Federer went through it, Djokovic has been through it multiple times. What separated them was what they had built around themselves and inside themselves to survive those periods and come out the other side. Ferrero built a version of that infrastructure around Alcaraz for 7 years. He is no longer there. And whether Samuel Lopez's approach, built more consciously around happiness and freedom than Ferrero's framework was, produces the same structural resilience over a decade, is a question that nobody can answer yet, including Ferrero. What Ferrero said in that interview was generous and warm, and clearly sincere in its admiration for the player he helped shape. It was also the most honest public thing he has said about the reason they split, and about the only real doubt he has ever expressed about whether Alcaraz becomes the greatest player in the history of the sport. He believes the talent is there. He has always believed the talent is there. His question has always been whether the life around the talent is built to sustain it across 15 years of professional tennis at the highest level. In December, he apparently concluded that it was not going to be built the way he wanted to build it. In March, asked if Alcaraz could become the GOAT, he essentially answered, yes, if he solves the thing I couldn't solve for him. That is not a compliment with a qualification. It is a qualification with a compliment attached to make it easier to publish. Read it again and see which one does the work. The most revealing detail in everything Ferrero has said since the split is almost the smallest one. He said in a different interview that if Alcaraz ever asked him to come back, he could not say no. Not that he would consider it, not that he would think about it depending on the circumstances, that he could not say no. From a man who has turned down 4 offers to coach top 20 players because he has not yet found the motivation to return to the tour. A man who is currently channeling his coaching energy into a young golfer and spending his days on a course in Bahrain. A man who was described by the people around him as having been deeply wounded by the way the split happened. That man says if Carlos calls, he answers, which tells you that Ferrero does not think the story is over. He thinks it is in an intermission, and intermissions, by definition, end when the main act has something it needs that only the intermission can provide. Whether Alcaraz ever makes that call is the most interesting subplot in men's tennis over the next few years. Not who wins Roland Garros this year, not whether Sinner takes the #1 ranking in Monte Carlo, not even whether Alcaraz defends all 3 of his clay titles. The real story is whether the discipline Ferrero spent 7 years instilling becomes permanent, something Alcaraz owns independently, something the coaching change cannot touch, or whether it was more bound up in Ferrero's presence than either of them fully realized. That answer will not arrive this week or this month. It will arrive slowly, across seasons, in the way results trend when the fire is low rather than when it is high. Ferrero knows that. That is exactly why he said what he said, and why the people reporting it as a glowing endorsement missed the most important part. If you want to understand more about the structural pressure Alcaraz is carrying into this clay season, the 4,300 points, the Sinner chase, the specific thing he said in Monte Carlo that nobody is reading correctly, the video is already up in the channel. It answers a different part of the same question.